I'd like to thank the Lake 100 and everyone for being here this afternoon. It's a very important topic, and at this time I'd like to introduce our panelists. First is Danielle Stroud. She's the CEO of Habitat for Humanity of Lake Sumter. She's an expert when it comes to local affordable housing issues, and she understands the affordable housing equation. She's on the front lines daily advocating for affordable housing. Next to her is Al Minner, is the city manager of Leesburg. He understands city government better than most, but most importantly, he understands the need for economic development. As you know, when Al took over the city of Leesburg, the city was in desperate shapes for its economic development. Our next panelist is Dan Tatro. He's a commercial investment specialist for Gazar Commercial Real Estate Group, LLC. And honestly, he is the local expert when it comes to all things dealing with land and development. I tell people all the time that Dan Tatro is probably the most wired in person in Central Florida when it comes to land and development. Next to him is Joe Zeiler, the president of Kefco Builders. He's an expert in housing. He is the largest independent custom home builder in Lake County. He is an outstanding builder who delivers a high quality product, and Joe is recognized as one of the top builders in the area. Plus he comes with decades and decades of experience. Before we get, as you can see by the panelists, we're covering all aspects of affordable housing, or workforce, what I call affordable workforce housing. My role in this, I'm going to moderate, but I'm also going to represent the build material end of it. I have about 43 years of experience. I can talk about the supply chains and those issues. Before we get going into the questions, though, I'm going to set the stage by giving you the current environment in housing, and then we'll dive right into our questions for the panelists. And I hope you find this interesting. Due to underbuilding of homes after the Great Recession and strength in housing formation over the last decade, the National Realtors Association just recently calculated that the housing shortage in America was 6.5 million units and growing continued because of underbuilding and the affordability issue. The National Association of Realtors just reported existing home sales in March were down 2.4% from the prior month and 22% from the prior year, with housing inventories nationally at 2.6 months and a median existing home sales price of $375,700. The U.S. Census Bureau reports March new residential sales of 683,000 units, which is 9.6% better than February and just 3.4% lower than last March. March housing starts were at an annual rate of 1,420,000 units, which is 8% below the February and 17.2% below the March of 2020. Permits were down 24.8% from the prior year. This is an important note, from 2010 to 2021, the average yearly housing starts in America were 1,076,000 units. So even at today's, we're 350,000, trending higher than the last 11 years. In Florida, for the first quarter of 23 versus 22, per the Florida Realtors Association, closed sales for the first quarter this year as compared to last year was 22% down, with a median home selling price of $399,900, which interestingly is 3.9% more than last year. Housing inventories are at 2.7 months for the first quarter versus 1 month versus last year, with 28% for a total of 18,000 transactions. This is the lowest amount of houses in inventory since 2020, the second quarter of 2020. According to Freddie Mac, the 30-year mortgage rate is 6.39% compared to 5.27% last year and 3.03% 2 years ago. Interest rates have more than doubled in 2 years. And finally, the banking crisis that manifested itself in late February and early March appears to be tapping the brakes on lending in regional and smaller banks, and they're the lifeblood of the home building industry. This should be give the advantage to the national builders. So I've tried to give you I know it's a lot of things, but to set the stage of where housing is now. Our first question's for Danielle. And panelists, if you don't mind, bring your mic as close as you do so people can hear you. Danielle, how many homes per year are you currently providing through Habitat for Humanity of Lake County? And if you had the resources, I mean, I'm talking about resources, land, financing, and staff, how many could you build based upon your need assessment?
So our fiscal year starts July, so we're about to start our new build schedule. We have 15 new builds planned for this upcoming year. We also have 50 rehabs, preserving units that are already there. So for us, we look at both. So basically 65 households that will be preserving or building in the coming year. Very easily, when we opened our applications for the past 2 years, we had 50 people apply to one home. To give you a little bit of perspective on the need, I could very easily say we could start building 500 homes a year and it still would not be enough.
So just to be clear, if you building 15 homes, there are 50 people per home, 750 homes right now that you could build for people.
Yes.
Okay. If you think about the resources, land, financing, and staff, which is the biggest challenge?
So for our top limitations, I would say access to affordable land is a significant barrier. Knowing as well, of course, the increases and influx of population, that's not going to get any easier. So that would definitely be one of the top things on my mind as I think about today and tomorrow for our production numbers.
Danielle, thinking about the challenges that you and your clients have in affordable home, the obstacles, give me your top 3 obstacles that you and your clients face, ranking 1 being the biggest obstacle.
So the one that I just said would be my number 1, the access to affordable land. So every penny counts when you're producing a product that you have to sell at a certain price point. These families can only afford to pay so much. So that's definitely number 1. From there, I would say the rising costs, right? So it costs more to build a home now than it has in the past, but not just the building cost, also just the cost of doing business. So since our families afford X, we have to raise or find other revenue sources to be able to be a sustainable organization to still produce that dollar value for that housing for the family that needs it. And then from there, I would definitely say there's some red tape that comes into all of this. So, thinking about Habitat, clearly Habitat cannot solve the problem and the complex situation that is the lack of affordable workforce housing in the community alone. So when it comes to eliminating barriers and thinking about complex problems, you have to be creative and find innovative solutions to do that. So unfortunately, some of the red tape doesn't allow for that innovation to occur, or it's challenging. And with that being said, to entice and incentivize maybe even for-profit builders to come to the table to produce a product that could work for this population, you have to make it as easy as possible to use. So the process and systems that Lake County has aren't necessarily there for someone to step up to the table and easily be able to perform.
Danielle, I heard a housing expert nationally saying that the problem nationally is the overcoding of houses. Now, for example, here in the state of Florida, after Andrew, the post-mortem on Andrew was that the problem wasn't the codes, it was the enforcement of the codes. But after Andrew, the state implemented all kinds of codes. And they said we were going to implement these codes, it would keep insurance companies in the state, and it would lower insurance rates. Tell me how that's worked out for anybody in this room. But secondly, because of coding, that does not allow you to build a good, better, best house, does it? Is that some of the issues that you face?
Yeah, and clearly, builders are running a business and they have to make a certain profit. And so now they're building to maximum sizes to be able to account for all that additional cost. And so ultimately, they can't build a product that is an entry-level product for what maybe your you once bought at your first home, or maybe your grandparents bought, or whatever, right? It doesn't exist anymore, and that's part of the problem.
Thank you, Danielle. First off, Al, I want to apologize. I'll mentor the city manager at Leesburg. He's got some of the most difficult questions because they're going to be tough. In Lake County, depending on what district you're building a home, the impact fees for roads, school, fire, parks, library, and admin fees for a small 1,500 square foot home is $10,830 to $12,536. And this does not include permit fees, zoning fees, which can add $3,500 to $5,000. And on top of these fees, you either have water, sewer, or septic fee costs, which can add thousands of dollars. In many locations in Lake County, the smallest affordable workforce house will be assessed with government fees for more than $20,000 or more. 10 to 15% of the total price of this home is government fees. My question is, do you think this is disproportionately impacting affordable workforce housing? And should government fees be based on the price of the home?
Actually, the impact, there are a couple of things in there. So first, I would say, I think everybody understands that impact fees are needed. And I think the question is what becomes the reasonable amount that should be paid? And so when you provided all those data points at the start of your speech about sales and interest rates and all these type of things, everybody knows that when you're out building a house, there's a certain price point you want to hit. And it's, for whatever reason, it's the government, it's those services at the end of the day that's the $20,000 that doesn't allow us to sell this house for $275, because that's the number. So the hard part about impact fees is about sustainability. So after somebody's built a house, after families moved in, after everybody's made their money on that product, the government then has to sustain that house. The government is responsible for providing the schools. The government is responsible for taking care of your sewage. The government is responsible for the most part of taking care of your water. So what's the best way to do that? I think it varies around the state. I think in our region, where the construction industry is a staple of economic development, it becomes super critical. That number becomes super critical because we're competing with the more urban areas where those impact fees are higher and folks are moving out and they're looking for affordability, and we're trying to keep our economy driving with the construction industry. You mentioned at the beginning too that some of the things we've done in Leesburg in the past 10 years, it's been based on recognizing that the construction industry is a stable to our economic development.
All right, can I challenge you on one thing? Most jurisdictions in America have no impact fees. That's a fact. If you do it, it's something, I think the last number was like 79, 80%. And they get their money for schools, roads, fire through ad valorem taxes. In the last 11 years in Lake County, coming out of the Great Recession, because of the growth of the construction industry and the attrition of prices here, Lake County's picked up about $100 million more in taxes, okay? How do you make an argument that growth doesn't pay for itself when during the Great Recession, when we had no growth, the county almost went bankrupt, and now 10 years after the Great Recession, we're $100 million more up on ad valorem collections? Can you make that argument that impact fees are really a necessity, or if it's more of a government control of growth? Because I'll turn this on you because we're having the same question.
Same question. Another.
You guys, when you came in here, you recognized you had to grow Lake County.
Yep.
Had you not grown Lake County, where would you be at? Had you not grown Leesburg, where would you be at today?
Probably in Minnesota, where everybody is leaving to come to Florida, right, because in Minnesota they don't have impact fees and they don't have sustainability. So, and that comes back to where does that impact fee number going? Okay, so let's talk about the Leesburg number, and it's actually like the 1,500 square foot house is about $15,000. Of that $15,000, about $3,000 of it is a city impact fee. About $2,000 of it is a water impact fee. So that's a third. $9,000 of it is the school board. So the county actually is relatively a little bit until they're talking about the road impact fee, where they actually want to put like another third on it, so that fee would almost be getting close to 20 grand. I can speak for Leesburg. No, your sewer fee right now is probably one of the most competitive fees in the region. You're paying less than $50 a month for 10,000 gallons. For us to hook you on, just look at the growth in South 27. That whole plan is predicated on the need for those developers to pay $2,770 a unit so that we can build a sewer bypass. We've been fortunate enough that we've been able to leverage some of the user fee money to do the stuff with the villages, to be able to get the user fee money and get the capacity at the plant. So I'd go back and argue, if developers don't pay that $2,770, then fees have to go up. Existing users would have to pay that $15 million. So I think that's a reasonable request. So it's the balance of, where do you want your monthly user fee? Do you want existing users to pay? And what's your real cost to hook up? I would argue, Don, that it's not, I don't want to pass the buck, but I would argue that, the major impact of an impact fee is not coming from a water and sewer impact. It's a real cost to connect to a system so that existing users don't have to pay that cost.
One last thing on impact fees. I know the school board's examining to raise their impact fees dramatically. However, in Lake and Sumter County, the big advantage you have is you have a disproportionate number of retirees that have no people in the school district that are paying school ad valorem taxes. Isn't that a consideration as you look at the total picture?
I don't want to pass the buck, Don.
Okay.
Because I can't talk about the school board.
All right,
I can talk about the city.
Well, let me ask you this.
But remember, the school board's 2/3 of that impact fee.
Last question about government fees, because government fees, you get a group of builders and developers, they feel like they're being crushed by government. And they said that's the reason why there can't be affordable workforce housing. Do you think it's reasonable in this environment, with the flood of tax monies coming into the county and the current economic conditions, to raise impact fees?
I don't want to sound like a politician, Don, but it really depends. In Leesburg's case, on the infrastructure connection size, yes, there is a need for impact fees. There could be a case where we would need to increase that fee depending on what some of the projected costs of some of those expansion connections are going to be. Again, back to the environment that you mentioned to begin with. But at the end of the day, it does become, how much do you subsidize that development? And the subsidy becomes is if you're not getting it from impact fees, then you need to get it from user fees. Then that does become a subsidy. If your system is maintained and you're connecting correctly and you're not going out and sprawling, then that's a reasonable impact. So I'm going to sit here and tell you every day that Leesburg's $2,770 for a sewer impact fee is totally reasonable, and our development patterns are compact and contiguous to connection points. As you start moving away from the mothership, those are the things that are going to drive your costs up.
But there's one other point that I think needs to be addressed. You have firemen, policemen, utility workers, teachers, people that live in your community. Right now, fair to say, with the price of housing and the price of money, 2 teachers, 2 firemen, 2 policemen can't afford to buy a house, and rents are skyrocketing. So is there a burden on municipalities and government agencies to recognize that they have, for the good of themselves and the community, provide a link to affordable housing? Does that need to be part of that equation?
There's a place for that, and I think we're all grappling for the answer.
I understand. Thank you. First off, I apologize. The city of Leesburg is the best city in the whole county as far as.
I got Don's question about a week ago, and I was like, oh, Jesus, I got to talk about impact fees with a bunch of construction people? Thanks, Don. Yeah, I'll take it as a compliment.
Dan Tatro, any project, any construction project starts with land. And last I heard, God is not creating more dirt. What is the demand for buildable land in Lake County? And take us through the process for buying raw land and turn it into buildable land, because people do not seem to understand that's a hell of a hill to climb.
Well, I don't have enough time to talk about what the process is. It takes forever at this point. There's a demand. Lake County's strong, guys. I mean, we're as busy as we have ever been. The process has gotten infinitely harder. I think it gets harder every day. A lot of people don't understand, and I like to explain what you do is you got to go find the land. Land is priced very high around here. It's going to continue to stay that way. And I've explained to people part of the reason is back when the crash hit in '08, the Great Recession, there was a lot of loans out on land. Banks quit loaning money on land just to loan it, thinking it was speculative at that point. Almost everybody that I know that owns big swaths of land, they own it free and clear now. So they're going to be patient in most cases. They don't have to sell it. They do want to sell it, but the prices are going to remain high as a result of that. So you have to factor in the cost of the land. Then you have to go out and, I start with contracts, guys. That's what we start with. It takes months to negotiate a contract on a big parcel anymore. The contracts are very one-sided. I think any attorney would tell you that, in the favor of a buyer in most cases. But that's the only way you're going to get it done, because they're not going to close until they get their approvals and their permits. And you can't blame them with all the stuff, the bureaucracy that you have to go through anymore. Once you get that negotiated, you still have to go through your zoning process in most cases. For any sort of multifamily, affordable housing, residential, and that's a process anymore, which we'll talk about on my next question. You probably got 150 to 180 days on that process. Well, then once they get that done, then they're willing to spend the money on the permitting process. They have to get permits from St. John's. They have to get permits from DOT in most cases. I mean, I could tell you stories about DOT being extremely difficult and wanting to move entrances, even though it might be on your property for a new development, and go to the neighbor and work with the neighbor to get access. It causes all kinds of delays because the neighbor then wants money for theirs, but DOT is forcing your hand. I mean, these problems arise every single day anymore. I mean, there's utility problems right now.
I guess you sort of made the case of all the bureaucracy.
Yep.
If you took 20 acres of land, and this is something, and you platted it up in quarter-acre lots, and you went through this process, 10, 15 years ago, you get $10,000, $15,000 lots. What's that lot going to cost today, probably?
With infrastructure or without infrastructure?
With infrastructure.
With infrastructure, you're probably going to have $75,000 to $80,000 in it per lot at this point. Cost.
So there's two parts, and I think we need to be real clear. The cost of land is escalating.
It's not coming down. It's not going to come down around here, in my opinion.
But more importantly, that infrastructure and the requirements of government and all the coding, that's probably escalated.
It's escalated threefold in the last 5 years. I mean, it's complicated.
Dan, what are the biggest obstacles that developers are facing developing affordable workforce housing in Lake County? And does any local government have programs that will give special considerations for workforce housing?
On the workforce housing side, and I mean this with the utmost respect to any of our commissioners or any elected officials in here, right now what we're seeing is it seems to be that the commissions are the most difficult when you have to rezone it for the workforce housing. It's a lot of voting on emotion with people around that don't like that type of housing, neighbors, and it's hard to get it approved right now at the commission level. And if you can't get it approved, you got nothing. So I think it needs to be a simpler process, and I'm going to take that right into the I don't know of anything on the county level or the city level that provides funding for any sort of workforce housing. But what we do have, which was just passed in the legislature, is the Live Local Act. And the Live Local Act, to put it in some simplistic terms, is going to provide, based on certain criteria of number of units that will be dedicated to affordable housing, a mechanism where it can skip the county and the city, so to speak, and it's not quite that simple, to permit such.
The other dynamic, and I want to touch on it before we leave you. 10 or 15 years ago, we did not have the national builders and the national hedge funds coming in and buying up land, and it was a lot of regional people, regional, local, and that has changed the dynamic in pricing of land considerably, hasn't it?
It has, and what they've done is we have nothing but nationals now for the most part. You do have land developers who go out and put the land under contract and get it all done, and they might do the site work, but they're ultimately flipping it to a national builder in all cases. All right, they want unit counts, because if they're going to have to pay $20,000 a unit for the dirt, they want to know how many units they're getting, because then they're going to have to put another 50 to 65,000 in to the infrastructure, which is where 5, 6, 7 years ago, when things started really happening again with the residential single-family side, you were getting lots. You could buy dirt for 10 or 15,000 a lot. Now we're up to 20 to 25,000, and the costs have skyrocketed to put the infrastructure in.
You could buy lots for 15 or 20,000.
You could buy, he's right, you could buy finished lots in 2012-13 for $15,000, finished lot. So the costs have risen dramatically. The process has gotten more complicated, but it's not just our local. I mean, you're talking FDOT, you're talking St. John's, you're talking SwiftMud, everything, DEP, everything has gotten more complicated with what we have to go through. The contracts, and that's another thing, landowners don't like the 18-month contracts. There's a lot of 18-month contracts that are required out there to get these sites entitled, platted, approved, engineered, and done. And and the contracts, the process is getting longer by the day.
Joe Zeiler, you built a lot of homes here in Lake County, and over the last 5 years, we have seen construction costs increase the most we've ever seen, probably in my lifetime and yours. What has the effect of these doubling of interest rates been on your buyers in the last 2 years, Joe?
Well, interestingly enough, our business model changed drastically about 4 years ago as affordability became unaffordable. Our average sale price is $657,000, not including the land. So we've kind of migrated away from what our original business model was, which was affordable housing. And I'll give you a couple of examples why. Lisa will remember back in, I lose track of time, around 10 or 11 years ago, I built and sold houses in Sleepy Hollow for $139,900, including the land, and made a profit of probably 15 to 20%. That same house today, I can't build the house for less than about $280,000, not including the land. Now, that dynamic back then, there was an impact fee waiver in place in the county, so there were no impact fees. The cost of the lots that I bought from Jim Bible at the time were $10,000 a piece, and the cost to build, was somewhere in the $65 to $70 a square foot price point. And in the last 2 years alone, we've seen that price escalation on the cost side luckily settled down some because of lumber, but at one point shot up over 50% in an 18-month period, just on cost. And as lumber came down, block went up 36%.
Yeah.
So, and drywall goes up $4 a board, and it just never has settled back down.
Well, Joe, the Wall Street Journal came out with an article just today saying that if you notice and I don't know if anyone picked up on this, Florida has 2.6 months of housing inventory. Nationally, it's like 2.5. And they say, okay, if housing's down, but the prices are up. In other words, you're down 22%, but the actual price of the house is up. And the Wall Street Journal came out with an article today saying that people are house locked. They have 3% interest rates. For them to sell that house, they'll be at 6. With the cost of housing going up plus new interest rate, it's just not affordable.
The move-up buyer is going to slowly disappear.
So my
for that
question-
reason,
So my
no.
question to you, you're the home you're selling. Are you seeing more cash buyers? Because I know a third of the people in Florida are cash buyers. Are you seeing more cash buyers? And how do you get around this interest rate thing on top of all these land costs and other costs that are going up? How do you get around all this?
From an affordability standpoint, it's mostly all in the land. You know, that 1,500 square foot house today, and I wouldn't even know this number had I not just done in the city of Eustis a bunch of rentals for myself. That 1,500 square foot house cost $150,000 to build, not including land, not including impact fees. They have an impact fee waiver program with the different vernaculars on the exterior. I'm able to get that. The city of Eustis at the time had an impact fee waiver on the water and sewer to try to spark some of the housing. And what did they end up spending on that over the years, Gary? $6 million in forgiveness of water and sewer impact fees in the city of Eustis, just to try to get, and everything I've bought have been infill lots, and those infill lots are $50,000 a piece for a city infill lot. That's what I've paid for those lots. So even these small homes that I'm building for rentals, my hard cost in them is around $218,000 between the house and the permits that I still have to pay for, and the cost of the land and developing the land. You know, I still got to do something to it, whether it's tree removal, site prep, those types of things. Fortunately, they're on water and sewer because even the cost of wells and septics has skyrocketed in the last 2 years.
Joe, I'm not going to let you by with something because this is a trend we're seeing with the national builders. You're building rentals, and the price of rents for a lot of rentals are, we hear numbers $1,500 to $2,000 for a 1 and 2 bedroom apartment. But we're seeing national home builders and builders like yourself build rentals. Instead of becoming builders, you're becoming rent landlord. Take me through that process. Did you do that to sustain your business, or are you doing that because you couldn't get people in houses?
No, I did it for neither. I did it for retirement. Retirement. But there's guys that did this 10 years ago that paid $120,000 for that same house, and their return is in the mid-20s on that, because their cost basis is so low. So you're going to make me feel bad about what I'm charging for rent, but my houses are getting in the $1,850 to $2,250 range, depending on if it's a duplex or if it's a single-family home. But that's because the cost of construction is so high. And the demand for rent is what it is. You're right, the apartment buildings they're seeing $1,600 now for a one-bedroom apartment over in Etowah, somewhere in that range, right behind the hospital.
We hear the legislature talking about mandating affordable housing, and other people are talking about government programs. Are you concerned that we're going to have to morph to some type of government housing program in a lot of areas, because we're getting to the point where 6.5 million units short nationally? At what point does the government step in and have to start providing units to keep people from being homeless?
I don't have an answer for that. Yeah, that is a tough question.
All right, my question then, let's go back to here local. We mentioned earlier about codes and regulations and stuff. Do you believe that in case of affordable workforce housing, there should be a relaxing of codes where you can build a good, better, best house and reestablish that first rung of the housing ladder?
Yeah, and I believe there needs to be. Kirby and I have had this conversation quite a few times. But again, a big part of it isn't so much, in my opinion, isn't so much in some of those codes that are related to building the house as they are in the restrictions on developing the land to put those homes on. You know, that's really been the big thing. And a lot can change in an 18-month period, as we all know. We've just seen it in 18 months. You put that land under contract and you try to entitle it, and, you know, that guy walks quick, you know, and gets cold feet when the economy and the interest rates do what they've done. You know, that's why a lot of these banks don't loan the money anymore. One of the biggest things that put some of these guys out of business the last time was having raw land. I worked for one of those builders at the time,
And
which was
Joe-
Pringle Development.
And Joe and Dan, I want to mention this, the banking crisis that emerged in late February, early March. How concerned are you about that? Because regional and small banks are the lifeblood of the building industry.
I'm concerned. 80% of all commercial loans, as an example, go through our small and regional banks.
Have you seen any freezing of the credit or pullback since this has happened?
Not in our area.
Yeah. And I'm out of touch with it because I don't borrow money. So
Okay.
I'm fortunate enough to have not. So
I want to say one thing about the restrictions Joe just brought up. This goes back to, I mean, as an example, we had something recently where we had in one of our local cities where the commissioners were trying to dictate what we will put inside the units. Okay? They were basically telling us, two commissioners, well, we want granite and we want it in the PUD and we want all this. I mean, I literally had to call the city, it wasn't the county, the city attorney for that and say, can they even do that? It's a little gray at this point. It wasn't Leesburg.
Wasn't.
That's right. Wasn't Leesburg.
and Carol Jaskowski's sitting over here. There's a similar PUD, not that far overreaching,
Yeah.
but on the exteriors and a lot of other items in Mount Dora.
Well, Mount Dora.
That we're building in right now, a neighborhood we're building in Mount Dora. And those, you know, he looks like Santa Claus with impact fees compared to Mount Dora. I mean, it's $26,000 to get a building permit in the city of Mount Dora. So,
I don't mean to jump in. I promise I would keep my mouth shut. But those costs that you're all struggling with, those are the government costs too. We're building a sewer plant. You know, a couple of years ago, we could build a sewer plant for $15 a gallon. Now that's $25 a gallon without buying land. So now you got to buy 100 acres to put a 2 or 3 million gallon plant on. Now you're at $50 a gallon. So that's the driver of the impact fee. And unfortunately, on the government side, those new taxes come in. That's to just prop up standard operation, the expansion of personnel in the police department. In Leesburg, we're 10 officers short right now. We programmed 73 officers. We're sitting at 63. We've got a couple of short. We're constantly competing with other entities driving up that range. The commission's going to be dealing with a proposal in the next couple months that Chief Hicks thinks our entry-level rate for a police officer needs to be $59,120. When I started 10 years ago, that number was around $39,000. And that's being driven by politics. That's being driven by folks don't want to be a police officer. That's being driven by other social issues with crime and prevention
It's
of
also
crime.
being driven by the private sector, which is paying more.
There you go. So,
Yeah.
so now that drives the train. So, okay, you get these ad valorem taxes in that should cover the expansion of new roads and new fire stations and new police stations and new sewer plants. But the bottom line, it doesn't.
Thank you, Al. My part of the equation is to talk about the supply chains. I'm going to go through that, and then we're going to go to some other questions. The supply chains are coming back to normal in the building material industry, other than some tightness in window and specialty items. We're getting to a normal point after 3 years. Continued uncertainty in housing is feeding into hesitation in America, and itself will keep the supply chain stressed because as interest rates go up and people look at demand shifts, they're not willing to make these big investments in manufacturing. Skilled labor shortages remain in construction while other labor issues have resolved, somewhat improved. Wage and benefits continue to inflate with no signs of abating. Trucking shortages due to equipment and part delays persist, and overall between fuel, labor, equipment costs, and insurance premium. No one is expecting trucking costs to lower. Trucking is a huge component of the building material industry. We track two metrics to measure costs: the Romac Whole House Commodity Index, which has measured monthly since April 2005 the structural building components to build a 22 square foot home here in Lake County. The index is sent out monthly as a free service to our builders and is considered one of the best barometers nationally for housing costs. In May 2019, before this pandemic, the whole house index was 33,135, and in April this last month it was 49,749. That's a 50.1% increase. However, since last May, the index has dropped 13.7% from a two-year high, which points out Joe's point earlier. Random Lengths is the other metrics we use. That's used to report lumber and panel pricing. In May 2021, the Random Lengths composite price for lumber was $1,414 per thousand, and last year it was $971 per thousand. This week's composite was $414 per thousand. Lumber is down 58.6% since last year and 80.7% since 2021. That's over $1,000 per thousand. The panel portion of the Random Lengths Index, today the panel price is $530 per thousand, which is 44% lower than last year, 65.4% lower in 2021. That equates to $30.69 per sheet of plywood. But here's the interesting part. Since 2019, before the pandemic, the composite is up 17.6%. So if you look at lumber from 2019 to today, it's only up 17.6%. But the whole house commodity index is up 50.1%. This tells you that non-wood commodity products that deal in trucking, labor, and raw materials are the issue. And if you hear what Wells Fargo is telling you, we're in a boom cycle for commodities, and they're expecting those to continue. I think we're probably at the bottom of the lumber and panel markets. I see little changes, little chance that anything's coming down in price, quite frankly, as things will heat up. And as I mentioned to Danielle earlier, a lot of the codes that were implemented after Andrew were supposed to keep insurance agencies and insurance costs in Florida. That has not worked out well. So as you can see, we've gone through giving you the overview of each one. We've got about 5-10 minutes left, so we're going to talk to our panelists about some other issues. This is for all the panelists. What can the business people in the Lake 100 do to provide affordable workforce housing? And I need you to keep your answers as concise as you possibly can because we want to get around. But what can we do today? Because there's a heck of a lot of problems we've heard here.
So I'm going to start. So you mentioned the Live Local Act, which is the Senate Bill 102. You made it seem very simple, but it's not. So I highly encourage you, if you have not looked over it, there's the Florida Housing Coalition produces like a summary sheet. There's a ton of stuff in there, a lot of really great stuff. So I encourage you to find out what's in there. Some of the things will be mandated and required. Other things are optional that dictate at the local level. So this is where you, as a business owner, as a community member, have the opportunity to influence your area in which you live for an opportunity that could present itself to benefit and produce increased production of workforce housing. So I highly encourage you to do that, do your homework, or call me and we'll talk about it.
Well, you know, Danielle, you did miss an opportunity for a shameless plug and
Oh yeah, just
Donate.
give me all your money.
donate to Habitat for Humanity.
Got some land? Come talk to me.
Al Minner, from the government perspective, and I know, first off, Leesburg does as good a job as anybody for housing, but from a government perspective, what can government and government officials in this room do to encourage affordable workforce housing?
You know, I think that's really market-driven because there's a couple markets. There's specialty markets, there's middle-class markets, there's workforce housing markets. And I think at the end of the day, it's just staying engaged with your elected officials, keeping them honest on on where they're at, being reasonable and understanding both sides of the equation, because every equation has to be balanced. And I think when we get out of whack is when one side or the other gets too far away from each other. So I think everybody's working in the same direction, but it takes engagement, it takes reasonability, and it takes thinking outside the box.
Do you think there's a disconnect with local government officials and the reality of how bad it is for working people to find housing? Because we have 525 employees, and that's the number one issue. We hear it all the time, and I'm concerned that there are a lot of our government officials that don't understand it, and I fear that this is an emergent issue that's going to be tough.
Again, I don't want to sound like a lawyer, but it depends. Frankly, I think Leesburg's pretty reasonable. There's other jurisdictions that are not, and it's that balance that you seek. And so, yes, is the answer to your question. There are jurisdictions, there are places where government officials and government policies are way out of whack, which is controlling and strangling economic development. And then on the other side of the equation, there's places where things don't happen because the pendulum is swung. I don't think you see that now in this market. But again, that's where it comes back to balance. I mean, we actually all have the same struggles. We demonstrated it here. Your cost of a house is the same cost as ours is building a sewer plant. The cost of personnel is rising. So to find that happy medium, we come up with different things. And sometimes infill housing doesn't sound attractive. If we said in Leesburg, hey, we're just doing infill housing, that would cripple the construction economy here. So there's a different shoe for every situation. And at the end of the day, again, it's just a matter of staying engaged, and both sides of the equation, officials as well as the private sector, need to understand both sides' struggles and work together to find different solutions that keep the engine running.
Do you worry about the homeless issue, though? Because it seems we're starting to see more homeless families and people who never thought they would be homeless now. It seems that you're seeing more activity in Lake County, and especially in Leesburg.
I will give you an honest answer. I am not overly concerned with the homeless issue. The homeless issue is an epidemic. It's not just Leesburg. It's not
Right.
just Lake. It's all around Florida. It's in the Northwest. It's in California. I think that's a whole nother issue. But at the end of the day, people are still moving to Florida, even though there's homeless folks.
Yeah.
So that's a whole nother. I don't think because you walk down Main Street and see a homeless person is going to prevent Joe from building a house.
Okay. Dan Tatro, from the developer and land side, what can this group and other people in the business community do to encourage affordable workforce housing?
Well, Al kind of said what I was thinking is, we need to talk to the commissioners in all the various cities, the county. We need to, I'm not going to call it educate because they're all intelligent folks, but they need to understand that we need it. They need to understand what affordable housing is. And what we don't need to do is we don't need to be voting on emotion. What I see in a lot of situations now is there's a lot of voting on emotion depending on who shows up to gripe about something. The votes need to be based on, is it a good site? Does it have good access? Does it meet the criteria that it needs to meet?
Does it meet the comp?
Correct. And I don't see a lot of that right now. I see a lot of voting on emotion without giving reasons for denial on stuff, especially when it comes to affordable housing.
Joe Tyler, you build houses all the time. You know the numbers better than anybody. What's the one thing people in this room could do to help this situation?
Well, I was thinking as everybody was answering, I still can't come up with a great answer, but I think even as builders, we've got to change the dynamic in order to meet something like that. For instance, I'll give you an example in Eustis, and it was controversial. There's a tiny home project that Forward Paths is building. It may not be the best location for it, in people's opinions, but the concept is ideal. And Gary might know, is there 10 or 12 units in there? 10. On 2 acres? Acre and a half. And, common area parking, single family, individual homes. Those homes, I do know the cost because I looked into building some of them for them at one time, are only going to be in the $80,000 to $90,000 range. The land, you know, for an acre and a half on city was fairly inexpensive. It was actually donated to her and her organization. But at the same time, if that land was purchased and it was developed, you could sell those little units probably in the 140 range, you know, and that's really the only way you're going to get affordable housing unless you redefine what affordable housing is. Like I mentioned to you the other day on the phone, I saw it was Wesh or somewhere, it was either Osceola or Volusia, in their definition as apartments. So you don't have the ownership. But to really give people the pride of the ownership, of the American dream of ownership, I think the county is going to have to relax a lot of what they do like the city did. You know, the city of Eustis requires one-car garages. That's, you know, it's got to be a minimum of 900 square foot, has to have a one-car garage. Those don't have one-car garages. They have a common garage area that can be used for storage. They have small storage pods on the side of them. But it's going to have to be that type of thinking that drives some of this because, you know, like the school district, they can't find teachers because they can't afford to live here.
Joe, I want to go back to your old Jim Walter days. I've known you long enough. In the South, back in the South, when they would put a cotton mill or a manufacturing facility in the rural South because it was so farmland, they'd put a factory in there. The new entity would build workforce housing around the cotton mill or whatever manufacturing place. They got cooperation with the city, and they would bring people from the rural areas to work those factories. The houses were small, 600, 700 square feet, that type housing situation. Do you foresee an old school situation like that?
Yes, but the difference is, did they own those or did they rent them?
They rented.
They rented them, yeah.
Yeah.
And in today's, we want to extend that out so they can own them.
And back in
You
the
know,
day,
if we can.
you worked for Jim Walter.
Correct.
Jim Walter's principle was if you owned a lot, you'd build on their lot to a certain level and they'd finish it.
And Florida building code squashed them out of business.
And Florida building codes wouldn't allow that, but that's how
Yeah,
a lot
they
of the
killed
homes,
them.
that's
Yeah.
how a lot of homes got
Yeah,
built
yeah.
in Florida.
Yeah, in fact, you know, not to dive into that, but when I moved to Florida in '96 to be a regional manager for Jim Walter, I took a pay cut moving from Tennessee because my division manager convinced me that everybody wants to live in Florida because it's less expensive and it's, you know, more desirable and all those things. And it was very affordable. I made $50,000 a year and I lived like a king in 1996 on $50,000. And now people that I know that make $50,000 can't rent an apartment. You know, most of them can't, and I hate to say this, can't rent one of my houses unless it's a dual income. That's how unaffordable things have become over that time. But Jim Walter had an interesting concept of partial completion, sweat equity, but Florida Building Code started, I mean, there's a Jim Walter law that was on the books, but partial completions were out the window. You can no longer do it under the Jim Walter permit. You know, it just got complicated. You couldn't do a partially complete house and let them finish the electric and the plumbing and all those things.
Well,
It became unaffordable.
our time is about done. This is our last question. I need you to just give me a sentence or a word. What happens if we do nothing to address the affordable workforce housing problem? What happens, Danielle?
Employers will suffer because their employees will be suffering. Ultimately, the families themselves will have hardship and they won't have money to spend in the economy. So it's all circular.
We
Al?
keep arguing.
It becomes a lot harder to get teachers, and I think the schools are one of the big items here at this point because you won't have any place for them to live. It's already a problem. It's just going to get worse.
And to piggyback on what he just said, they go elsewhere. That's the bottom line. They go elsewhere. They go where it is affordable.
And you know,
They don't come here anymore.
And
Yeah.
Joe, you just said something that another article just came out, that Florida's become an inexpensive state and that people are looking to go back to Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama, and Mississippi, where they're a heck of a lot cheaper. You know, I think there's a broken reality that says people will come here at all costs. think that could be an issue that we need to start realizing. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention today. I want to thank our panelists, and would you mind giving up for our panelists today? Thank you to the Lake 100, and please support affordable workforce housing. Thank you very much.